Estamos con Amie Thomasson en el seminario PHYSIS. Bienvenida. Vamos a entrevistarla porque ella es una de las líderes mundiales en torno a la cuestión de la ontología, en torno a cuestiones también de ontología, cuestiones de estética también. De manera que vamos a hacerle unas preguntas relacionadas con el congreso que está teniendo lugar sobre the Question of Ontology. So, Amie, you are famous for saying things like ontology is trivial. So, why the question of ontology is still relevant?
Okay, yeah, it's a good question. So, what I think is trivial is that we can answer certain kinds of existence questions that have been traditionally debated by ontologists. Do properties exist? Do numbers exist? Do tables exist? By trivial inferences from uncontroversial premises. So you can move from this chair is gray to this chair has the property of grayness to there's a property. Now these are all existence questions, and existence questions considered in what Carnap would have considered the internal mode. That is where we simply ask these questions utilizing an existing linguistic framework with those rules of use in place. And I think there are these rules of use that introduce property talk to us that enable you to make that inference. Those are all trivial. So why is ontology still relevant? That's the question. That kind of ontology I don't think is terribly relevant. So that is to say, debating questions about whether properties, numbers, etc. really exist, I don't think is particularly interesting, and that's part of what I'm doing. Nonetheless, I do think that a lot of traditional metaphysics is relevant and interesting nonetheless. So in addition to these internal questions, there are external questions about what linguistic or conceptual framework we should use or should use for a given purpose. And I think that's where the really interesting work of metaphysics lies. Now in some cases you can see people who are arguing for an eliminativist view about properties or numbers as implicitly pressing for getting rid of that bit of language. Right? In other cases, you can see more traditional metaphysical debates about free will, for example, as debates about what concept of freedom we should use when we're trying to evaluate the actions of others and ourselves and hold them responsible. And these kinds of questions about what conceptual scheme and language we should use, questions in conceptual ethics and conceptual engineering, I think are extremely relevant and extremely important to our lives. So what I've really been pushing for in my later work after Ontology Made Easy is this way of understanding the interesting and relevant work that remains from metaphysics, not as trying to make discoveries about what really exists that might be surprising or rival the sciences, but as engaged in the really interesting and worldly work of figuring out what conceptual scheme we should use. And I think that can be extremely important.
Thank you. I think that I am totally in with your answer. So then, is there anything that is ontology very difficult to answer in a way that to know what is easy, what are the easy questions, is not easy to discover?
Okay, so first of all, let me try to clarify what I mean by easy. When I say that ontology is easy, that's a technical term for me. I need some name for my view. But it's technical in the following way. If I say that ontology is easy, then I mean two things by that. One, that there aren't any sort of well-formed and answerable questions that can't be addressed by some form of conceptual work and or empirical work. So what I reject is the sense that there are questions that are epistemically metaphysical in Ted Sider's sense. That is, in the sense that they are neither answerable by straightforward empirical means nor by conceptual work. The second sense, this is what unites me with Schiffer's work and then Frege work in philosophy of mathematics, is that I think many debates about existence can be answered by trivial arguments, like I mentioned a minute ago, that take us from an uncontroversial premise through a conceptual truth to an ontological conclusion. Okay, so there are certainly questions of metaphysics that can't be answered by these kinds of trivial inferences. I think a lot of the disputed existence questions can be, but not every question of metaphysics is an existence question. What I'm committed to is that to do the work that needs doing, we don't need to engage in anything more mysterious than conceptual work and empirical work. Now, that conceptual work for me can take two forms. It can be conceptual analysis, trying to figure out how our actual conceptual scheme or terms do work, what their interrelations are, and so on. Or it can be normative, right? And this is the work in conceptual ethics and conceptual engineering I was talking about a minute ago, of figuring out what terms and concepts we ought to use, or what relations we ought to hold between them, and so on. Now, I think the last part of your question was, is it always easy to tell which questions are easy? Right. Yeah. So again, in my technical sense of easy, right? Remember, all it takes is that the work doesn't require anything more than conceptual and empirical work. Conceptual and empirical work, of course, can each be hard. I mean, they can take a lifetime of difficulties to figure out even the answer to a simple empirical question, right? And similarly, to do a serious conceptual analysis of how our whole conceptual scheme hangs together, or even to try to figure out what are the real rules of use that govern free, for example. So they can both be difficult in the everyday sense, but not in my technical sense. Is it always easy to figure out which questions are easy? So that resolves to me into the question, does it require anything more than conceptual work and or empirical work to figure out which questions can be addressed easily? And I think there the answer is no, it doesn't require more. So if you want to know if there are any trivial inferences that can take us, for example, from the chair is gray to the chair has the property of grayness as a property, what you'll be engaged in primarily is conceptual analysis. Now, if you think that doing conceptual analysis by me reflecting on my intuitions isn't good enough, maybe I'm not a typical speaker, or maybe I'm influenced, we can add empirical work. We can do X5, or we can also look to linguistic theory to tell us what the rules of use are that introduce terminology like property terminology into our vocabulary, right? But linguistics is also empirical work. So figuring out where there are these conceptual truths that can underwrite the trivial inferences that can give us sometimes trivial answers to ontological questions also is a matter that I think can be addressed through a combination of conceptual and empirical work.
Thank you, it's so enlightening. So it's fantastic because then if we generalize the project of getting trivial inference through these entailments, so what do you think? Do you think that we should distinguish between degrees of triviality? This comes because of the following. To say that there is the property of being white because the table is white, that sounds more trivial than to say that if there are electrons, blah, 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 then there is a table. In the second case, it seems that it's less trivial. It seems that we are crossing two different languages. The language of physics with physical terms, and the language of ordinary objects with ordinary kinds. And that sounds more substantive than the case of the property that we are just considering the entailments in the same framework.
Mm-hmm.
So would you distinguish then, would you admit that there are degrees of triviality, or there are questions or trivial answers which are more trivial than others? Or entailments that are more trivial than others?
Yeah, so I don't distinguish degrees of triviality. For me, it's trivial only if there is a conceptual truth, and there is one or there isn't one that entitles you to this inference. Obviously, sometimes it can be a difficult empirical question or a conceptual analytic question whether there is this conceptual truth or not. But if there's not the conceptual truth, you don't get the trivial inference to answer your ontological question. That being said, so also just to clarify, when I talk about there being trivial inferences, say, to the existence of properties and numbers on the one hand, to the existence of tables and chairs on the other hand, right? It's important to bear in mind that these trivial inferences for tables and chairs come not from the language of physics. They come from the language of the competing ontologists, right? So the eliminativist ontologists who want to deny that there are tables and chairs, or nihilists, for example, will speak of particles arranged table-wise, or if it's tabling around here instead. And they do that in order to be able to preserve, as far as possible, our ordinary discourse, our ways of talking, so we can still be saying something either true or nearly as good as true when we say there are tables in this room, right? But to do that, they have to build in all sorts of conditions that aren't part of the talk of physics. So for it to be tabling around here, or for there to be particles arranged table-wise here, all those social conditions have to be built in. So for there to be a table doesn't just require a certain particles in spatio-temporal arrangements. And so it also requires that it be perhaps intentionally created in a social context where tables have certain norms of use, and so on. And so all that's built into those conditions. So for there to be particles arranged table-wise, or for it to be tabling around here, in the terminology of the ontologists who use this terminology, builds in all of these social conditions, whatever it takes normally for them to be tables, apart from that there would be some such object there in this ontological language. And that's why you get that trivial entailment. So I don't think you can get trivial entailments from the mere language of physics. Now that being said, I haven't fully answered your question, because then the deeper question is, well, what about the relationship between the language of physics, say, and our ordinary talk? And that's a much harder question. I certainly don't think there are trivial entailments from the language of physics to table talk. Are there any trivial entailments? I'm not sure. There certainly are also conceptual interrelationships within our language, or if you like, within different frameworks, that aren't just those of trivial entailment. Right? There's also some conceptual interrelations that treat stuff as evidentially relevant, or as fulfilling one of many different possible sufficient conditions, or whatever. So I do think there's robust and interesting conceptual work to be done in trying to work out what conceptual relationships there are between various parts of our scientific languages, the language of biology, the language of physics, the language of chemistry, and our ordinary talk, and the relationships among these and each other too, the biological, the chemical, the physical. Those are all really interesting questions that I haven't addressed. That's all for me a matter of conceptual work, which might occasionally also have to make use of empirical work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think that also this is a very nice answer for me, and I think that so this is closely related to the last question. It's just that then, on the one hand, you would say that, to summarize your project, your overall project, not just questions about existence, there are other substantive questions for philosophy or for ontology. And then it looks like that the investigation about these entailments is very relevant to understand the relationship between not just to discover, so to speak, or to infer the existence of ordinary objects or numbers, but also these entailments look so important to understand these conceptual relationships between different languages and how our conceptual schemes work. So I think that this is so interesting, and that was my last question.
Yeah, I think I agree completely. Substantive isn't one of my words. I don't have a definition of substantive debates. But certainly I think that these kinds of questions are very interesting, very philosophical questions that can take a lifetime of work. So I do think that, right, as you say, Ontology Made Easy was just focused on existence questions that have become the center of debate among metaphysicians for a number of decades. And part of my push there wasn't to presuppose those are the only questions of metaphysics, but to steer us back to things that are more useful and interesting. And among those, as you say, some of these questions that are more useful and interesting are questions about how our different ways of talking are interrelated. What are the conceptual interrelations between the language of physics and everyday language? Or what are the interrelationships between the language of morality and the ordinary language or modality and so on? I think these are all very interesting questions. These are, for me, questions on the sort of conceptual analytic side. What overall conceptual scheme do we use? What in our conceptual scheme is optional for us, and what is sort of required in order to have cognition at all, if there is any such thing? These are all really interesting questions. And then on the other hand, there are all these interesting normative conceptual questions about what conceptual scheme we ought to use when we talk about a person, when we talk about freedom, right? When we talk about women or men, right? When we talk about death, right? These are all questions that have huge relevance to our lives, and figuring out how to precify these concepts if we need to or want to, how we ought to use them, what their connections are to other concepts like responsibility or morality, right? These are all interesting questions, in part for the sort of normative conceptual work, for conceptual engineering and conceptual ethics. And I think, again, that's where a lot of the best traditional work in philosophy, what it's actually been up to, without always being upfront about this. So that's another area where I think there's a lot of really important, relevant, and interesting work to be done. But again, I think one thing that's important is that we be clear about what this work is and what the success conditions are for it, and not think of ourselves or present ourselves as if we're peering deep into reality and discovering metaphysical truths that might rival those of the sciences or something like that. But instead see it for what it is, as the kind of conceptual work, whether descriptive or normative, that it is.
Great. So there is philosophy or ontology beyond easy ontology. And also, then to finish the interview, I would like to ask you some details about your new book. Could you tell us something about the results? What are your main views about normativity?
Okay, yes, there's actually, I was going to ask you which books. There's actually sort of two that are in progress. One is closer than the other. So, yeah, the first one, I guess what you have in mind is the one on modality, which has been in progress since Ontology Made Easy was in progress. It started as one book, and then it got too long, and it separated, and the existence questions came out first. So that arose from the thought that at least a lot of, though probably not all of, the questions of metaphysics are either existence questions or implicitly modal questions, questions about the natures and essences of things of various kinds, identity and persistence questions, and so on. So the modality book attempts to bring modal questions under the same sort of easy umbrella by treating claims of metaphysical necessity as sort of object language expressions of semantic rules. And so on this view, these kinds of claims of necessity have an implicitly normative function of conveying rules of use, not the function of describing essences or modal properties or possible worlds. And then I try to show how then using easy ontology, we can build back from that talk of modal truths, of modal properties, even of possible worlds. But the important thing about that for me is that then, I argue, makes it possible to address these metaphysical modal questions, say about the conditions of personal identity, or the existence conditions for artifacts, or any of these traditional questions, via conceptual and empirical work. See? Because you can start from your conceptual competence, make explicit these conceptual rules, and what follows from them, sometimes combined with empirical truths, or through logical reasoning, and thereby get to your metaphysical modal truths. Again, sort of demystifying the epistemology of modality, that is metaphysical modality. So that's one, and then that is meant to bring these modal questions also under the heading of what can be done through conceptual and empirical work. Then the other one is what I've been alluding to, which is work on what Carnap would have considered the external questions, which involves trying to develop and defend this way of reconceiving of metaphysics as having its most interesting questions, those that aren't so trivial to answer, as involving often normative conceptual work. So there, I've already got some preliminary papers out on this topic, trying to show how a lot of traditional debates about personal identity, about identity as works of art, whatever, can be seen as implicitly pressing for views about how the terms ought to be used, not just analyzing how they are used. And we'll talk, I've got some papers out talking about how we can do this kind of normative conceptual work, why it doesn't require serious metaphysics, and why it's got real importance to our lives and to worldly issues that matter. So that'll be the third book. It'll be kind of a trilogy, so to speak, of trying to really lay out this whole view, which then also I hope really makes good on the idea that I'm not out to kill metaphysics, to say, oh, that's all trivial and stupid, let's get rid of it. What I'm out to do is to sort of reconceive of it by bringing out some of what we've been doing all along and the best of it, bringing out sort of pragmatic, normative side of that, and try to show how we can reconceive what metaphysics can be up to, why it's not a rival to the sciences, why it does have worldly relevance in these terms. That's really what I want to get at the end of the day.
Thank you. I think that we all are looking forward to see these books published. So thank you very much for your time. And
thank you for the great questions and the interview. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Thank you.